Fleet Commander Vreth had overseen 17 successful planetary subjugations. He was not a creature given to self-doubt. The sovereignty of the Eternal Veil did not conquer through brute force. That was the primitive method of lesser civilizations, the kind that hadn't yet discovered that pain was the most efficient instrument of control. Why destroy infrastructure when you could simply make the inhabitants of a planet wish, desperately and completely, that they had never been born? The Veil's neural disruptors could stimulate agony at the cellular level, could make every nerve ending in a body scream simultaneously without causing a single millimeter of physical damage. Clean, surgical, effective. But first, you needed a baseline. Every species had a threshold, a point at which the pain became so overwhelming that the body simply refused to continue. The Veil scientists called it the collapse point. Find it, map it, and you owned a civilization. The subjugation of a world required only three things: a pre-invasion scan of the dominant species, a calibrated disruptor array, and patience. You didn't even need to land troops. You broadcast the signal, the population collapsed, and you descended at your leisure to accept surrender. Vreth had done it 17 times. The 18th was supposed to be routine. Scan results are in, Commander, said science adept Thessalivo from her station, her forefingers moving across the console with practiced efficiency. Target world, third planet, Sol system. Indigenous species, bipedal, carbon-based, oxygen-breathing. Designated, humans. She paused, pulling baseline metabolic profile now. Selecting the scan subject. Protocol calls for the most vulnerable member of the population to establish the lower pain threshold. Proceed, Vreth said, settling back into his command cradle. The Veil always scanned the weakest first. Children, typically. The elderly. The infirm. Establish the floor. Everything above it was just a sliding scale. Thessalivo's console chimed. She leaned forward, studied the readout. A long silence followed, the kind of silence that made Vreth sit up straighter. Adept, he said. Aye. She stopped, turned to look at him. Her secondary eyelids, the ones that only flickered when she was genuinely unsettled, were fluttering rapidly. I need a second opinion, Commander. I believe the scanner may be malfunctioning. He crossed the bridge in 6 long strides, looked at the holographic medical projection hovering above her console. The scan subject was a human child, a young one, by the estimation of the ship's anthropological database, perhaps 9 or 10 of their solar years in age. Small, soft-looking, the kind of creature that, on most worlds, would be wrapped in protective coverings and kept away from anything sharper than an eating utensil. But the medical overlay was wrong. It had to be wrong. Rerun the scan, Vreth said quietly. I've run it 4 times, sir. He stared at the hologram. The bone density mapping alone was extraordinary, not in the sense of the child's bones being strong. They were objectively quite fragile by galactic standards, but in the sense of what was mapped across them. Fracture markers. Not current fractures. Healed ones. The computer had flagged and cataloged them in red, and there were so many that the child's skeletal projection glowed like something emberlit from within. Left radius, healed. Right clavicle, healed. 2 separate rib fractures on the left side, healed at different times, meaning the child had broken ribs, recovered, and then broken different ribs on the same side later. 3 metacarpal bones in the right hand, healed. The left ankle, which had apparently been broken and healed, and then somehow broken and healed again. And this was the weakest one. That's Tactical Prime Goreth 7 had drifted over from his own station, staring at the hologram with the expression of a being watching something deeply wrong unfold in slow motion. That's their weakest? Lower bound scan subject. Child. Approximately 9 solar years of age. Thessalivo confirmed in a voice that had gone very flat and careful. These injuries were not inflicted. The cultural database cross-reference indicates most of them are consistent with voluntary physical activity. The radius fracture matches a common pattern their medical records call a fall from a climbing structure. The metacarpal injuries are consistent with impact from a sport they practice recreationally. Goreth 7 stared at her. The child broke its hand. Playing. 3 bones in its hand. Yes. A heavy silence settled over the bridge. And the ribs? Vreth asked. First incident. Impact collision during a group physical game. Second incident. A separate physical game, different sport, approximately 14 of their months later. Thessalivo's voice remained flat, but her secondary eyelids hadn't stopped flickering. Commander, I want to draw your attention to the adrenal gland profile. She overlaid it on the hologram. It bloomed up in orange, the two small organs sitting just above the child's kidneys, and Vrethakul felt something cold move through him. He had seen adrenal profiles on hundreds of species. On most prey-class organisms, the adrenal system was a small, quiet thing. A gentle tap on the shoulder that said danger is near, perhaps you should move faster. Even in apex predators, it was simply a mechanism of aggression, a way of making a large and dangerous creature slightly more large and dangerous for a brief period. The human child's adrenal system looked like it had been engineered by something that hated the concept of physical limitation. Those glands are enormous, Gorth7 said. He sounded like a being who had just discovered something unpleasant living under a rock he had casually overturned. Proportionally, yes. And more significant than the size is the activation profile. Thessalivo pulled up a secondary overlay, a chemical cascade diagram, the hormonal sequence that the human body ran through when it perceived a threat. When one of these creatures experiences extreme physical trauma, the adrenal system does not simply increase alertness. It suppresses pain. Actively, it produces a cocktail of compounds that intercepts pain signals in transit and blocks them before they can register consciously. The creature can be sustaining catastrophic physical damage and feel, functionally, almost nothing. Vrethakul stared at the diagram for a very long time. For how long, he finally asked. Variable. Minutes, in extreme cases. Long enough, Thessalivo said carefully, to continue functioning through injuries that would render most sapient species completely non-operational. The bridge was quiet. Beyond the viewport, the blue-white marble of the third planet turned slowly in the light of its unremarkable yellow star, serene and ignorant of the fleet hanging above it. Pull the scar tissue mapping, Vrethakul said. Thessalivo did. The hologram transformed. The child's body now lit up with a ghostly secondary layer, the ghost topography of every wound that had ever been opened and closed on that small form. There were dozens. Not from the healed fractures, but surface wounds. Skin lacerations. Burns, several burns, two of which had been significant enough to damage the underlying tissue. An old puncture wound on the left knee. Multiple abrasion patterns, the kind produced by the small body impacting rough surfaces at speed, repeatedly, over many years. It's covered in scars, Gorth7 said. They all are, Thessalivo replied. I widened the scan while you were looking. I've pulled profiles on 47 additional humans for comparison across age groups. She hesitated. Commander, the scarring is not anomalous. It is baseline. It is normal. The adult humans are worse. Nobody said anything. They just. Gorth7 gestured vaguely at the hologram, at the glowing map of healed catastrophe that was apparently just a regular child on a regular planet. They just keep breaking and healing? Over and over. The bone regrowth is actually denser than the original structure, Thessalivo said. Each time a bone heals, it deposits additional calcium along the fracture lines. Their medical literature refers to this as the bone growing back stronger at the point of injury. It is apparently a well-known phenomenon among them. They have a saying about it. Of course they do, Vrethakul murmured. They consider it. She paused, consulting the cultural database, a positive thing. The children, they encourage one another to take risks. They celebrate when they heal. There is a cultural ritual where other members of the tribe mark the casts applied to broken limbs with well wishes and artistic expressions. They treat the period of healing from significant trauma as a social event. Gorth7 sat down heavily in his chair. He had the look of a being reevaluating several of his core assumptions about the universe. Run me the pain threshold estimate, Vrethakul said. Best guess. What would it take to reach the collapse point on an adult human? Thessalivo was quiet for a moment. Then, Commander, I don't think I can give you a reliable collapse point estimate. Why not? Because every model I run keeps returning anomalous results. The data suggests that these creatures' collapse points are not fixed. They are variable. They appear to shift based on context. She turned to face him fully. I found documentation in their medical literature. They have recorded cases, multiple, verified cases, of humans sustaining what their physicians classify as objectively unsurvivable injuries, and then surviving them. Not because the damage was less than estimated, but because the humans simply refused to stop. There are records of humans with multiple organ failures remaining conscious and goal-directed for extended periods. There are records of humans with compound fractures of major structural bones continuing to move and act on those limbs. She stopped, started again. There is a record of a human female who, after sustaining a traumatic injury during a wilderness excursion, walked for 11 hours on a fractured pelvis to reach safety because there was no one coming to help her. The bridge was very, very quiet. 11 hours, Vreth Ackle repeated. 11 hours. With a fractured pelvis. Because she decided to. Vreth Ackle looked back at the hologram of the child, 9 years old, riddled with the ghost marks of bones broken and healed, hands that had been shattered in play and rebuilt, covered in the casual scars of a childhood spent apparently flinging itself at the world with reckless totality. And he felt something he had not felt in 17 campaigns. He felt afraid, not of the child, not of any single human, but of the principle the child represented. Because the Veil's entire method of conquest rested on a single foundational assumption, that pain was the ultimate language. That every sapient creature, when faced with sufficient agony, would eventually say yes, would surrender, would choose to make it stop above all other choices. And here was a species that had apparently spent its entire evolutionary history learning to say no. The decision to stand down the invasion fleet took 4 hours of debate among the senior officers. It was, ultimately, not a close decision. Gorth 7 had made the argument plainly. We have 17 campaigns. On all 17 worlds, our primary advantage was the certainty that we could generate pain faster than our targets could endure it. We have no evidence that sealing exists for humans. We would be starting a war with a species whose children treat catastrophic physical injury as a normal part of growing up, whose adults have documented pain tolerances that exceed our instrument's ability to reliably measure, and whose cultural framework treats suffering and survival as something to be celebrated, shared, and grown stronger from. He had paused. I was a soldier before I was an officer, and I am telling you that I do not know how you defeat an enemy who does not know when they are beaten. The fleet held position, a subdued, nervous position. The kind of position you take when you have realized that the thing you were about to poke is considerably larger than it looked. It was Thessalivo who proposed the alternative. A cultural exchange. Peaceful first contact. Come in transparency. Extend the invitation, and for the love of all the Veil's ancestors, do not let them know that the initial plan had been invasion. Vreth Ackle approved it. He told himself it was strategy, that you studied what you could not defeat. That knowledge was never wasted. He was lying to himself slightly. The truth was simpler. He wanted to understand them. He wanted to look at whatever had produced those small, scar-covered, bone-fractured, indestructible children and understand what it was made of. The exchange station was built in 3 weeks, orbiting in the comfortable L4 point of the moon the humans called their own. The humans, when contacted through careful radio frequency greeting, they had not yet achieved standard faster-than-light communication, but had been reaching out into the void with electromagnetic signals for over a century, an act of optimism Thessalivo found either charming or terrifying, depending on the hour, responded with a wariness that was entirely sensible and a curiosity that was entirely human. They sent representatives. 6 of them. The delegation that came aboard the exchange station included 2 scientists, 1 diplomat, 1 military observer. This one made Gorth 7 deeply uncomfortable. Though the human was small and came unarmed, 1 linguist, and by some bureaucratic accident that the humans seemed unconcerned by. A 16-year-old boy named Marcus who was the son of one of the scientists and had apparently simply not been left behind on the shuttle when the opportunity arose. The Veil's crew had prepared extensively for first contact. They had reviewed the cultural database, practiced the greeting protocols, arranged the common spaces to be as non-threatening as possible. They had not prepared for Marcus. Marcus was not threatening. He was, if anything, enthusiastic in a way that registered on most of the Veil's crew as slightly alarming. He walked through the exchange station looking at everything with a bright, unguarded curiosity, asked questions constantly, and within the first hour had made what appeared to be a genuine friend out of Thessalivo by asking her, completely earnestly, how her secondary eyelids worked and whether they filtered UV light. She had explained. He had listened with total attention. He had then told her that he'd broken his arm twice and showed her the faded scar on his forearm from a surgery to insert a pin that had later been removed. He told the story cheerfully, as though it were a good memory. Thessalievo had excused herself after that and sat quietly in a supply room for several minutes. Over the following weeks, the exchange developed its own rhythms. The human scientists asked questions that were remarkable for their breadth and the quality of their thinking. The Veil's scientists answered carefully, gave access to limited but genuine data, and watched the humans process it with an almost unseemly delight. The diplomat was perceptive and careful and made Vreth feel, in a way he wasn't sure he enjoyed, that he was being very gently evaluated. The military observer was quiet and watchful, and, Gorth 7 privately noted, moved like someone who had trained their body seriously for a long time. The linguist worked at such a pace through the Veil's language that she was conducting basic conversations in it before the third week ended. And Marcus wandered. He explored every open corridor of the exchange station with the casual comfort of someone who had decided, unilaterally, that this place was not dangerous. He ate Veil-prepared nutrient pastes with the cheerful willingness of a creature with essentially no food neophobia. He sat in observation lounges and stared at the stars for long periods, quiet in a way that was different from his usual animated presence, a thoughtful kind of quiet. He learned 17 words in the Veil's language and deployed them relentlessly and incorrectly in ways that were somehow never annoying. He had a kind of gravity to him, not authority. He was 16 and knew it and wasn't pretending otherwise. But presence, the quality of someone who was entirely, comfortably himself, and found the universe a fascinating place to be. Vreth observed him from a professional distance and tried to reconcile this cheerful, curious, soft-spoken boy with the medical hologram that had stopped an invasion fleet in its tracks. He could not. That was, he gradually realized, part of the point. The malfunction happened on a Tuesday, which was what the humans called the third day of their week, a system of time management Thessalievo had noted was largely arbitrary, but which the humans adhered to with remarkable consistency. It was not a catastrophic malfunction. The exchange station was well built. But the gravimetric stabilizer in Section 7 experienced a cascading failure that sent that section of the station into a sudden, sharp oscillation before the emergency systems engaged, and in the 12 seconds between failure and correction, Section 7 became a very dangerous place to be. Section 7 contained 3 of the Veil's junior science crew, and 1 alien. The oscillation hit without warning. One of the junior crew members, Yethso, 22 years old, 2 years into her first posting, was thrown into a console. The safety rails on the console caught her, but caught her badly, and she heard and felt the horrible percussive wrongness that meant something in her body had given way. She went down. The oscillation was still happening. The emergency lighting came up red. She could not move. The pain was total and enormous, and she was 22 and she was terrified, and she was lying on the floor of Section 7 unable to get up while the room shook around her. Something grabbed her arm. She looked up. Marcus, 16 years old, 5'9", 140 pounds, a human child by any reasonable galactic metric, had crossed Section 7 during the oscillation. She would not have believed it was possible. The oscillation had been severe enough to take her off her feet, and she was rated for emergency conditions. But he had crossed the room in the chaos, and he was here, crouched beside her, and his face was very calm. "Can you move?" he asked. His translator rendered it clean and flat. Something in my side. I cannot." "Okay," he said, and that was all he said. He got his arms under her, adjusted his grip with a quick competence, and stood. She felt him sway. He had not expected her weight. He adjusted. The oscillation was still happening, lower now as the emergency systems fought it, but still happening. He was standing in it, holding her, looking for the exit. She heard it before she saw it on his face. A sharp, involuntary exhale through his teeth. Not a scream, not a cry. A sound that was almost nothing, almost controlled, that she recognized only because the Veil's medical database had briefed her on the physiological sounds of human pain. She looked at his shoulder. It was wrong. The geometry of it was wrong. The joint had, she understood, with a lurch of horror, come apart. Not broken. Dislocated. The ball had come out of the socket, and the shoulder on that side of his body had dropped and changed shape, and he was standing there holding her with an arm attached to a joint that was no longer properly articulating, and he was still moving. "Put me down," she said. "You are injured. Put me down." "We need to get to the door," he said. His voice was tight. Controlled tight, not frightened tight. The kind of tight you heard from someone who had decided something and was doing it. "Marcus." "It's okay," he said. "I can feel it." "It's not, it's okay. The door is 12 meters. I can do 12 meters. He did 12 meters. He did 12 meters with a dislocated shoulder during a gravimetric oscillation, carrying a member of a species he had known for 3 weeks. And when the emergency seal on the Section 7 door opened and the response crew was there, and they took Yetso from his arms, he sat down on the floor of the corridor very suddenly and put his head back against the wall and breathed. Then he looked at the response crew leader and said, in his terrible broken veil language, "She needs medical." Side. Injured side. The response crew leader stared at him, at his shoulder, at the way he was holding that arm against his body. "You," she started. "You're." "I know," he said. "It's okay. It goes back in." He actually almost smiled, which was one of the most unsettling things any member of the Veil's crew had ever witnessed. It's happened before. The medical team fixed his shoulder. It was not a simple process. Dislocations rarely are, and the human made exactly one short, sharp sound when the joint went back into place, and then went quiet immediately, and the medical team finished the procedure in a silence that felt like reverence. Yetso had 3 cracked ribs. She would be in medical for 6 days. She kept asking about the human boy. She asked so many times that they eventually let Marcus sit with her in the medical bay, his arm in the sling the human physicians had recommended he wear, even though he kept insisting he was fine. Vrethakal went to see them both. He stood in the doorway of the medical bay and looked at this picture. His junior crew member, young and hurt and on the mend, and the human boy sitting in a chair beside her, his arms strapped against his body, telling her something in a mixture of her language and his own, some story that was making her, despite her cracked ribs, make the gesture that the database said was their equivalent of laughter. He watched for a long time. Then he went back to his command cradle, and he sat down, and he looked at the blue-white planet through the viewport, and he thought about what it meant. What it actually, genuinely meant. The Veil had built its empire on the certainty that pain was the great equalizer. That everything which lived wanted, above all other things, not to hurt. That you could reduce any sapient creature to its most basic self, the part that only wanted the hurting to stop, and once you found that part, you owned it. And here was a species that had looked pain in the face for every single year of its evolutionary history and learned, not to avoid it, but to carry it, to work through it, to look at a cracked and healed bone and see not damage but evidence of survival, to feel a joint leave its socket and decide, consciously, that 12 meters was a number it could still reach. They were not invulnerable. They were something rarer and more frightening than invulnerable. They were breakable, fully, easily breakable. The child's medical scan had confirmed that much, and they kept going anyway. They broke and they healed, and they carried the evidence of that healing in their bones like a record, like a testimony, and they got up and they did it again. And when someone else was in danger, they didn't calculate the cost to themselves first. They just moved. He thought of Marcus crossing Section 7 during the oscillation. He thought of the human's face in the corridor, not unaware of the pain, not beyond it, not pretending it wasn't there. Aware of it, completely aware of it, and choosing to keep moving anyway because Yetso needed to get to the door. He thought of the 11-hour walk on the fractured pelvis. He thought of the sport broken hand. He thought of the scars on the child's body that were apparently just a normal part of growing up. He thought of a civilization that looked at all of that, at all the breaking and the mending and the scars and the endless, ordinary catastrophe of existing in a body that could be hurt, and called it living. He sat with that thought for a long time. Then he called Thessalivo to his office. "I want to send a message to Sovereign Command," he said. "I wanted to go with my full commendation and personal certification." "Understood, Commander. What is the content?" Vrethakal looked at his hands, at his own unbroken, carefully preserved, never once fractured bones, at the skin that had never been scarred because he had spent his career in command suites and safe positions, at the body of a being who had treated discomfort as a signal to stop and pain as an emergency, and had built an empire on the assumption that everything else did too. The content, he said, is that we are requesting reclassification of the third planet, Sol system, indigenous species humans, from subjugation class to protected sovereign class. He paused. And I want to attach a full recommendation for formal alliance negotiations. Military alliance. Thessalivo was quiet for a moment. On what grounds? Command will want justification. The grounds, Vrethakal said, are that we have spent 300 years building an empire on the principle that pain is the one truth every living thing shares. And we have just encountered a species that looks at pain the way we look at weather, as a condition to be noted, endured, and walked through on the way to somewhere else. He paused. I do not want those creatures as enemies. I want them as allies. And if I am honest, I want them as, I want to understand them. I want to know how a civilization learns to build that into itself. How you teach your children that breaking is not the end, that the healed place is stronger than the original. He looked back at the viewport. Because we have never learned that, he said quietly. And I think that is a lack we should remedy. The formal alliance negotiations took 8 months. They were, by all accounts, complex, careful, occasionally contentious, and ultimately successful. On the day the documents were signed, Marcus, who had returned to Earth with the human delegation and was, technically, not present for the ceremony, sent a personal message to Thessalivo. She had given him her communication address on the last day of the exchange, a small impulsive gesture she had felt oddly certain about. The message was short. It said, I heard it went well. My shoulder is completely fine, by the way. I know you were worried. Tell Commander Vrethakal that I said congratulations. Then, in very careful, significantly improved Veil language, see you next time. Thessalivo read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Vrethakal, which she knew he would expect, and then she sat quietly for a moment and thought about a 9-year-old child with ember-lit bones and a life that had already been broken and mended in a dozen places, and all the children like it, and all the adults they became, walking around on a small blue planet treating catastrophe as Tuesday. She thought about what it meant to come from a people that had made endurance not an exception but an inheritance. Not a remarkable trait, but a common one. Not a story told about heroes, but a baseline expectation of ordinary children. She thought, we were going to conquer them. She thought, we had no idea. She sent Marcus a message back. It said, in his language, because she had been practicing, next time. Yes. Then she got up and went back to work, and in the viewport behind her, the small blue planet continued its patient orbit, unbothered, as it had always been unbothered, around its unremarkable yellow star.